Hello and welcome to Planet Smasher HQ. Bit of a weird day today. I'm about to go into Canterbury to give a lecture on playtesting to the game design students at Canterbury Christchurch University. First time I've done anything like this. Stick around and let's see how it goes. Okay, let's talk about playtesting tabletop games. I hope that a lot of this material will relate to playtesting any kind of game, and that's because as I'll explain, some of my background is from outside of games as well. One of the themes here is going to be how to learn about anything when everyone is lying to you all the time, and I'll go into what I mean by that. So who am I? My name is Mike. I am the designer of award-winning tabletop miniatures games. Although Joe trashed awards, I'm real proud to say that yesterday I won the 2024 UK Games Expo Award for Best Miniature Game for my new game, Hobgoblin. Thank you very much. If you'd like to have a look at it, I offer a free quick start guide there. You can grab a copy and have a look at what the rules are for that. This is the one that most people know me for because it's a toy car game. You get Hot Wheels cars and you push them around on the table. In addition to designing miniature games, which has only just become my full-time gig, for the last 20 years I've been working in software as a product manager, product designer, product leader. And so I worked for a bunch of companies. I worked on BBC iPlayer around 2011, 2012, when it was just turning into the iPlayer that you guys know now. I worked for a while for Amazon, but not for very long because I hated it. And if anybody wants to talk about how shit Amazon is to work for, I'm happy to do that. I worked for a while on a couple of different startups, the most recent one being super awesome. Our mission was making the internet safer for kids. And we got bought by Epic Games. And so I worked for the last 3 years for Epic Games on Fortnite. And specifically, I was working on Fortnite Creative, the toolkit for game makers, and fascinating products to work on, really, really enjoyable. And why that's relevant, particularly to playtesting, is there is a very, very strong overlap between how I think about playtesting tabletop games or games in general and how I think about doing essentially like user testing and user research for products. And a lot of the stuff that I learned as a product manager, testing software ideas and startup ideas and prototypes for pieces of software, just totally crossed over into testing games. So the first thing to know is playtesting is brutal, but I guarantee if you don't playtest, your game stinks. And this is my vision of what playtesting your game is like. You don't want to beat the little Spider-Man pinata to death. It's your Spider-Man pinata, it's your friend. And that's why playtesting is so important, because you are never going to brutalize your game in a way that it needs to be brutalized. You just love it too much. And the truth is that right now, if you've got a game idea, you think that game idea is amazing, you're a genius, this is the best idea that's ever been come up with, this is a hallucination. And between here and the end state, which is that your game is actually amazing, lies this massive amount of work, which is predominantly playtesting. And that's unfortunately the reality. You've got to playtest, you've got to iterate, you've got to repeat. So we have to be good at playtesting, because if you don't playtest, your game is garbage. And when I pick up a new game and I read it and I go, this game is garbage, it's always obvious to me how much they haven't playtested it. But the problem is that you've got to test with other people. I'm going to go into some types of playtesting, because you can playtest by yourself, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But most of the time you're going to be playtesting with other people. And the problem you've got is that as humans, we are mostly just okay to each other. And we're sort of programmed not to be horrible monsters to each other. And particularly, if I put myself out there a little bit and put myself on the line, you are likely to lie to me to make sure that you don't hurt my feelings. And I love this book called The Mom Test. Highly recommend it. It's not anything to do with playtesting. It's about testing your business ideas when you're a startup founder. This book is great, real short book, and it basically says, how could you learn something about your idea from your mum when your mum is just absolutely going to tell you that your idea is brilliant and that you're a wonderful person? She's your mum. So in this book, Rob Fitzpatrick talks about a bunch of different things, but one of the things he talks about is not presenting your ego for damage. Say say this is a friend's idea. Say this is, I'm sort of wanting to know how your behavior in the past has been. And I'm going to go into some of these things in a bit more detail, but if you go to your mum and say, hey, I've got this great idea for a game, do you think this will be fun? Or I've got a great idea for a business, do you think this is great? She'll say, yes, dear, that's an amazing idea. The example he gives is, hey mum, you like cooking, would you like a cookbook? Would you use a cookbook on your app? Would you like your iPad? She's going to say, yeah, that's absolutely fine. And then if you ask her a different, better question, which is, have you ever looked in the App Store for a cookery app? And she says, no, I've got enough cookery books. Then what you've done is you've learned from past behaviors something that's actually way more useful than future hypotheticals. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And the last, I think, underlying thing is that when you hear things from people, I'll talk about it more, you want to accept what they say, but you want to dig underneath it. So this first idea, I think, can be quite powerful, which is you can just pretend that your game isn't yours. I use this all the time. Or I sort of say, oh yeah, I'm working on this game, but it's like, I'm not really invested in it. Like, it's early on, I don't really care, I probably won't do anything with it. Or just say that, this is a friend's game, or I'm working for a company and I don't mind whether this, I just work here. And this is about distancing yourself from the thing that's under examination, so that when you ask for negative feedback, people think that it's okay, it's sort of portioned about the thing that you're building, rather than it being you presenting yourself like a puppy for approval, and them not wanting to just slap you down. So that's one trick. The second thing about playtesting, I think more specifically, this applies in lots of different testing environments, but one of the key things here is to observe what the playtesters are doing and not to guide their activity. So when you are showing a game to someone, it's quite tempting to participate in the playtest. I always try to step outside and be there as a sort of observer. And when someone asks you how to play your game, don't tell them how to play your game. If they say, oh, how does this rule work? Or am I supposed to go into this location? Just ask them, turn that question around and say, what do you think you're supposed to do? Or if they're querying a rule, just give them the rule book or the notes that you've got and say, well, how do you understand this rule to work? Which initially can feel really irritating of you. It took me a while to get past the idea that I'm being kind of obstructive and irritating, but it's an incredibly useful way to learn whether the problem is in the explanation, whether the problem is in their expectations. And if you tell them the answer to the question, I have had this quite often where I will tell them the answer to a rules question and I haven't even written that down. That's just something that I've made up. And in the worst cases, Joe and I have both seen games where, because somebody kept explaining a rule, they kind of became blind to the fact that the rule wasn't even written in the rule book. And when it goes into blind playtesting or gets published, because it hasn't been playtested enough, it turns out there's a critical piece of the game missing. So I will always observe and I will never guide as much as possible. And also, when you're in the playtesting environment, a massive theme is just to ask what sucked. Absolutely laser-focused, seeking for negative feedback. Because anything they tell you that's positive, broadly speaking, valueless to me. If you're fishing for compliments, if you're asking them, did you enjoy it? They're gonna revert to that like not ego-damaging human behavior of saying, yeah, the game was fine. But if you say, okay, cool, what was the worst thing? Or what was the lowest moment in that game? Or what was this game did that wasn't what you expected? Ask for specifics about what sucked. And it's sort of asking for collaboration. You can appeal to their sense of kind of helping you out and collaborating with you and be like, if there's one thing that I could make better about this game, like what's the thing that you think I should focus on? Like, give them opportunities to sort of with joy and love in their heart, give you some negative feedback. And framing those questions is super important, which I won't go into in this talk, but that book, A Mom Test, has a load of really good ideas about how to frame questions so that you're not putting your ego on the line in front of people. So when I put up beta rules for open playtesting, when I'm sort of doing playtesting in person, this, like, what was the worst thing, what sucked, what should I fix, it's always the first thing out of my mouth. you're in a playtesting situation, and again, I'm here talking about the sort of, I guess, the most common form of playtesting, which is you're in the room with some people. Maybe you're playing the game with them, maybe you're watching them play the game, but there's some people in front of you, and you want to read the room for what's going on. And here are some things that I am often looking out for. So number one is I'm looking for confusion. Do people understand what the purpose of the game is? Do they understand what their objective in the game is? Do they understand how the mechanics interact? And they often can't tell you when they are confused, and they almost certainly can't tell you why they are confused. So you're going to have to watch for these moments. Because quite often, particularly with written feedback, when you put something out for playtesting and you ask for written feedback and you're not there, they might say something like, yeah, we got lost in the combat resolution mechanic, or like there was this level and I couldn't figure out how to get out of it. But they won't be able to tell you where in that process of playing the game they got confused, because they were confused. And quite often it will be like some little piece further up in their chain that led to, they made a misassumption here, which meant that 3 pieces didn't fit together a couple turns later or a couple of actions later. Whereas you can be on the lookout for, oh, they've misinterpreted that, that's interesting. Again, observe, don't guide. If they've misinterpreted a rule, there's a temptation to fix their assumption immediately, but it's, for me, more valuable to watch the thing unspool and maybe fall to pieces, because maybe they'll figure out that they've made a mistake and they'll put it back together, and you can make some assumptions about how people will interpret that rule. But sometimes it will just collapse in front of them, and then that's incredibly useful learning moment. So looking for confusion, I think, is the first thing that I'm always looking for. Looking for disappointment. This is, I think, something that's perhaps more relevant slightly earlier on in the design cycle, which is you're trying to create an engine for fun, and there will be times when people are disappointed that they thought they would be able to do something, and then they can't. So when I was playtesting, my toy car game Gaslands, there was a moment in playtesting where someone was like, "Oh, cool! Can I hit this like obstacle that we've got here, and can I do a jump? Are there rules for jumping? Can I jump?" And I had to say, no, there's no rules for jumping. We don't support jumping in this game. And they're really sad and deflated, and that allowed me to know, well, okay, that's interesting. I might need to put jumping rules in, but I might not. But like, it's a piece of information that I have extracted from watching them think, oh, is something going to be real? Can something happen? It's also, I think, for me, designing the sort of games where I'm trying to connect the sort of mechanics with the fantasy and the fiction. The player will come in with an idea of the fantasy and the fiction, and your mechanics may or may not satisfy their kind of expectations of those tropes. And so looking for disappointment is a place that also teaches me whether there are tropes missing. Like, have I got a critical thing that people are expecting to see because they've seen it in the movies and my game's not providing it? There's another form of disappointment that's worth mentioning there that slipped my mind. Disappointing. Look for cognitive dissonance. This is somewhat related, but it's those moments when someone is playing your game and they go, what? Because 2 mechanics interact, or 2 events interact in a way that just doesn't make sense for them. Either they don't interact in the way that they think the fiction should work, or the mechanic is too obscure for them, or it's not kind of readable for them. So there are quite often moments where people, I say there are quite often moments, my games must just be slightly prone to this. I'm tending to try and push weird and innovative mechanics too much of the time, and there's a conversation about how much innovation players can stomach in any particular game type. But if I'm pushing innovations onto the playtesters and they just run out of road, or it doesn't make sense to them, I'll give you a specific example. So in Gaslands, which is a game about driving cars around, the mechanic is that you want to move, and then you want to try and change gear. And if you change gear, you get to go faster, and if you get faster, you get more activations in the turn. And so the game is about, sort of managing the risk of driving quickly and having less control with the advantage of driving quickly and having more activations. because of the way that it ended up being the easiest to manage, it turns out in Gaslands, the faster you drive, the more you can shoot your guns, which is weird and doesn't make any sense. It's like you get more sort of minutes in the hour than the other players who are going slower. And that was a moment of cognitive dissonance that kept coming up. People were like, driving faster makes you shoot more often? This doesn't make any sense. And I didn't listen to that piece of feedback, or rather I considered that piece of feedback and decided that I wasn't going to do anything about it. I was just going to leave that piece of cognitive dissonance in. But it was very, very clear from the players that were giving me feedback during playtesting that that was something that was baffling them. So there are lots of ways that that manifests, and that's something to look out for. And probably the easiest one is to look for disengagement. So again, we're trying to, particularly with tabletop games, we're trying to create engines of fun for groups of people. And it's fairly common in tabletop games to have turn-based play and to have some downtime. You know, there are some exceptions, but it's fairly unavoidable in lots of different designs. And there's also the fact that, you know, in any multiplayer game, you can have people who are clearly beginning to win, and you can have people that are beginning to lose. And if they are losing, but they're kind of logically eliminated already, then you can get disengagement. If you've got long periods of downtime between player actions, you can get disengagement. And if you just get, it can also just be an indication that there is not enough to hold their attention. There is not enough mechanics to keep them thinking about. There's not enough planning that they can do before their turn begins. And so disengagement, people checking their phones, people kind of zoning out. This is something that I'm always interested in. And when I see someone zoning out, I will sometimes just pause the game and ask them, like, you know, is this a family thing and you just need to be on the phone texting people? Or is there something that, like, do you have anything to think about? Like, are you thinking about your next turn, or is, you know, what's going on with you? And I guess just to connect it back to the previous idea that everyone's lying to you, a lot of this is about looking at people's behaviors and not asking them retrospectively, like, what was happening for them. Just look at what is happening for them. Interpret their actual behaviors rather than asking them for hypothetical or self reflection. So another big important thing with playtesting from my perspective is to go into a playtesting session with a specific intention in mind, because you can simply turn up with a group of people and play your game, but it is much stronger to know what it is that you want to learn. And I think that's very linked to where you are in the process. So when you've got a prototype and it's just the beginnings of the idea, then really what you want to learn is, like, is the basic idea exciting? Are some of the core loops going to grab people's attention? If the game falls apart during the play, maybe that's okay. Maybe you're not learning about whether the game is a functioning whole. Maybe you're just learning about whether the idea is exciting to people. And maybe you don't even need to play the whole game, because once you've got, you know, a couple turns in and people are like, yeah, I'm excited about this, maybe that's enough. Similarly, towards the end of the process, there's been a bunch of playtests where I've come in and I've said to the playtesters, listen, I really want to check out this new tweak that I've done to the combat mechanic. I just want to focus on, you know, whether the combat mechanic works. I'm not interested in feedback on the core loops or the core mechanics or, you know, the faction system. Like, don't tell me about that stuff, we'll just assume. And the other thing is that sometimes you can have playtesting sessions where, particularly with your core, like your friendliest playtesting group, the people that you're comfortable and confident with and work with the most, sometimes playtesting sessions can collapse a couple of rounds into discussions, valuable discussions about, oh, okay, this isn't working, how could this be better, you know, oh, that was a bit wrong, and they'll get excited about giving you design ideas and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes that's perfect and exactly where you want to be in the process, and sometimes I will, at the start of a playtesting session, I will say to my friends, hey, let's just play this game from start to finish. Let's assume the rules are fixed. I want to see how the whole game feels overall. And neither of them is right or wrong. It's just simply, number one, what do you need to get out of a particular playtesting session? And number two, setting the expectation with the playtesters so that they can be the most helpful to you as they can. Because they want to help, that's why they've agreed to do that. And so help them be as helpful as they can by being intentional. So yeah, don't try and test everything at once, because if you test everything at once, you're going to be bouncing around, you're going to get confused, you'll be changing rules as you go, and you'll get messy data that's filled with, if you change the game halfway through, if you change a core mechanic halfway through, but you were trying to test the faction system, you haven't tested the faction system because everything's moved from underneath. So be clear about what you're testing and don't try and test too much at the same time. Joe mentioned this as well. Beware of your playtesters' solutions. In fact, you mentioned this thing, which a bunch of people have said. I like this. Neil Gaiman's one person that said. There's another great designer called Robin D. Laws who says the same thing. That when people tell you something's wrong, they're almost always right. And when they tell you how to fix it, they're almost always wrong. Slightly disagree with Neil on that. I think when they tell you exactly how to fix it, take that solution and put it in your big hopper of possible solutions. In fact, I like to throw away the name tag of who came up with the solution, so I'm not sort of biased. Like, there's a bunch of possible ways of solving this problem. Let's agree that the problem is real. And when they tell you about their solution, because people tend to tell you about this idea that they've got, they sense that something's wrong and they tell you about an idea. But most playtesters, unless they are kind of practiced at this, they won't have the experience to sort of say, ooh, I didn't enjoy shooting that minigun. It didn't feel like a minigun. I think you should make it so the minigun has 20 dice rather than 10 dice. That would be better. Then you need to ask the question oh, okay, so you didn't feel that the minigun was right. What about it didn't feel right? And maybe asking more questions to get down to what their feeling was, ignoring their solution. And maybe actually what they're feeling is that, it was weird that the minigun just fired immediately without having some time to spin up, or that they weren't able to fire the minigun for long enough and they wanted to sustain fire. So digging down from what can on the surface be like a suggestion of something you should immediately incorporate into your rules, that actually tends to often be a signal that they have a feeling that they are trying to express, and your job as the person figuring out the game is to absorb that problem and absorb that truth that they have and dig down to what it means. So I will never reject those sort of solutions out of hand. They're telling you something really valuable, which is they don't feel good about a part of the game. Great, let's have and hold that. But I don't understand it yet because you're telling me a solution. You're not telling me what's wrong. And so I want to understand what it is that you're feeling, or what it is that's dissonant about what you were able to do, or what happened and what you thought was going to happen. And to the point of Neil and Joe, the problem with other people's solutions is that they aren't you. They don't have the vision of the game that you have. They may or they may not have the skills that you have. But regardless of whether they've got the skills, they are not the vision holder for the game. And so you are ultimately, or if you're working in a team, you're ultimately the gatekeeper for what the right solution is, because you know what it's supposed to feel like to play that game. And so it's really, really, really easy, particularly when you've got a vocal set of playtesters, to ping pong between people's opinions. And I have been guilty of this many times when someone has said, hey, this unit is too strong, this weapon is too good, and or this mechanic is, is no good and it needs to come out. And if you don't have a strong vision of your game and maybe a set of design principles to enshrine that vision, you can hear that feedback and you can take it on too literally, and you can sort of change things in response to other people telling you stuff. And I have been around circles where I've ended up in the same three places multiple times because I'm hearing different voices from different playtesters, and I'm not having the confidence to stick to my vision of the game and say, wait, let me hear all of this, let me bring all this together, and let me think what is actually going to fit my vision. Because you are going to get a lot of feedback, and it's hard to reject it all. So I made a couple of references here to playtesting at different stages of the game. There's no, the game's development, there's no hard and fast rules here. But one thing I would say is, how early should you playtest your game? Really early. One of the things that I see game designers who are new to games design making the mistake quite often is that they will keep their game idea precious to them and secret. And they will hold it close to them, partly because they're afraid of what might happen if they show it to someone, partly because they have the perhaps misapprehension that someone will steal that idea from them. We've all got more ideas than we can build. No one's going to steal your shitty idea. So I would say get it onto the table as fast as possible with another human, because the moment that you put a game in front of another human is the first moment that you realise that it's just a piece of crap and it's just going to fall to pieces. And this always happens with my prototypes the first time. I've never had a prototype that hasn't, at least somewhere in the game, just completely collapsed. So I think you have to get prototyping really, really early in the process. But you can save your friends from having to endure your utterly awful, collapsing first game if you bias a little bit to solo playtesting at the start of development. And so figuring out, this is fairly obvious when you're building a digital game. This kind of almost automatically happens. But when you're building a tabletop game, you need to do it intentionally. You need to find a way to sit down and play this game by yourself. And some games, that's really easy. You can play both sides, or there's a solo mode. Some games are really difficult. Social games, games with hidden information, these are really bastard hard to solo playtest. I've got a game at the moment that I'm writing for Osprey called Pacific Command, which is all about hidden information and fog of war, and it's just really difficult to playtest in any meaningful way by myself, and it's slowing my process down because of that. In the middle, I'll talk a bit about the difference between guided and observed playtesting, but you are testing with other humans, you're likely testing with humans in the same room as you, and that's great because you need really high bandwidth access to people who are experiencing your game, and you need to be able to ask them questions and get really good information really fast and try things out and tweak in the moment and try new iterations. But towards the end of the development process, this stuff becomes much less important. Although actually there's an argument that solo playtesting can actually become very important again towards the end when you're making microscopic tweaks and little changes. But blind testing becomes incredibly important. And blind testing is almost useless at the beginning of the development process. I'll talk about blind testing a little bit more, but it's something that's absolutely essential. And if you don't blind playtest, your tabletop game is almost certainly garbage. But you can't really do it at the beginning. So solo playtesting is something that will start in your mind and then it will happen on your table. And for me, this is like the way that I prototype games is by playing them and by sort of fumbling out with, because I write mostly miniatures games, I'm fumbling around with the miniatures, I'm trying to feel how the space works, how the relationships of these objects is going to play out, whether the mechanics of the dice and the cards are starting to feel right. But also through later iterations of the game, when I'm absorbing feedback from my playtesting sessions and I'm trying to figure out the right solutions, I'll again return to the solo playtesting table and I'll be moving things around and pretending to be both players. And it's sometimes hard to manage your playing tactically or strategically from both sides. In some cases, I've written sort of AI systems for the opponents to sort of lift some of that cognitive load, so I don't have to think as two players. I can automate another player. That can be a way of sort of making sure that you're thinking about the game's design whilst playing one player rather than trying to hold an entire set of players in your mind. I can't really see the squirrel there, but there's a squirrel there. Oh yeah. And then the difference between guided playtesting and observed playtesting is, in the first case, early on we are playing the game together. I'm being quite generous about showing you the game. I'm explaining the rules. I'm tweaking things as I go through. I'm maybe not even playing the rules in the rulebook I wrote because I'm trying to test, are the mechanics feeling right? Is the flow of the game feeling right? But the observed playtesting is different. It's okay, here is the game. I might do a rules explain up front, but I want to see how you guys can handle this game. Have I made myself clear? Does the iconography on my components make sense? Like, what do you do that I didn't expect you to do? Where do you start exhibiting behavior that I kind of feel is out of order for this game, but I haven't outlawed it? And so this is just in watching people stumble and fail to play your game, or stumble and fail to extract fun from your game in front of you, incredibly valuable. There's a thing in some board game companies, and it's also common in software design companies, where you can have like a sealed room with one-way mirror like you have in police interrogations, and those kinds of playtesting, those kinds of user research suites are incredibly interesting and valuable, but I've never had access to one of those, not in my professional life as a product person or as a playtester. But you can still sit quietly and creepily in the corner watching them and being belligerent about not giving them answers when they turn to you and go, Mike, how is this supposed to work? You tell me. And then the last thing is the blind playtesting. And blind playtesting is essential. This is you giving your game to another group of people and saying, play my game. And there's two things I think that are important about playtesting. One is that you need to just give it to them and be somewhere else. You're not in the room. Absolutely not in the room, and I'll explain why. And the second thing is, this is only valuable right at the end of the process. The sort of information that you're getting from a blind playtest is only really relevant when you're just at the point where you're kind of getting your final, in my case, manuscript together, or your final box set, or your final game together. And that's because what you're trying to learn is when they open the game and they try and play it, does it all just hang together? Does it explain itself? Do they understand what the purpose of the game is? What kind of fun they're supposed to be having? Do they understand what the objectives are? Do they understand how to set it up? Do they understand how to get moving? Do they understand how the rules mechanics work? Do they understand when the game is over, the gnarliest little details of your rule system, are they being communicated? And so it can be that you do a blind playtest and it's successful and it's brilliant and they completely get the game and they understand what you were trying to do and they understand why they were supposed to be having fun and they have fun. But a different kind of success is this, where they essentially can't play your game, or they play your game and they hate it. Or they play your game and they're enjoying it and then they just get completely stuck and they cannot find the answer to something. And quite often that's about the presentation of your game. It's about the presentation of your rules in a tabletop game, or in a digital game it can be the fact that your level design or something about your mechanics is just simply not explaining itself well enough and they can't figure their way out of the box. The other meaning of this image is that this is how I feel about my game at this stage quite often. I have playtested it so much that I despise my game, and if anything is wrong with it, I just want to throw it in the bin and walk away. But this is why playtesting is brutal. So this is valuable, and I think the ways that I have found that are useful to get this kind of blind playtesting, the most useful is to get people to video themselves playing your tabletop game. This is a big ask, and I'm quite lucky that I managed to find some people quite early on in Gasland's development. So these guys, two goons with a YouTube channel, they picked it up because I was running an open beta, and they shot themselves playing 3 or 4 games of Gasland's back before it was published, when it was still in a playtesting stage. And watching these guys struggle through my game, misunderstand rules, fill in the gaps with assumptions, and just generally completely arse up the game was incredibly valuable. They still had a good time, and so watching where they had a good time and why, watching where the rules were that they mistook, just incredibly valuable. If you can get this kind of stuff, this is the absolute premier sort of gold standard. You can also ask for written feedback. This is tricky. This sort of written feedback, these kind of reports, after action reports from game sessions, they have the feeling of truth about them, but I found them significantly less useful. Partly because if they get confused, as I said, they quite often don't know why they were confused and where they started to get confused. And you lose all of the sort of stuff that I was talking about watching the room and seeing people's behavior in real time rather than their post-rationalization of it. So you can sometimes get good stuff from this, but honestly, it's just there's no comparison to this stuff, and I would be a little bit suspicious of the things that they say because they're coming back to it after the fact. It may be several days later. They're only potentially representing the views of one of the multiple players that enjoyed the session. So blind playtesting is super important. So I think to wrap up and refresh, playtesting is brutal, but you have to do it. Everyone is lying to you, so you have to ask them questions that don't involve your ego, and you have to ask them about their behaviors and observe their behaviors rather than ask them for their hypothetical future intentions. You've got to be intentional with your playtesting, figure out what it is that you're trying to do in each playtesting session, and you've got to playtest early, and often you just got to keep playtesting all the time. If you want to know some more about this, I blab on about this on my podcast, which is the Rule of Carnage, which you can find on YouTube. We did a couple of episodes on that. Yeah, thank you very much. Man at the back.
I want to kick off and say that we have on campus the one-way mirror rooms in the building.
Oh.
So if you ever wanted to do some playtesting and watch someone play a game, you should be able to just take them in a room to do it. So if you ever want to come and do it, and students as well. And then the question was, at what point do you hit the nuclear option? So if you playtest and nothing's worked, at what point do you say, this just doesn't work, stop?
At what point do you abandon the game idea?
Or just a mechanical testing? Do like a major change?
So I tend to see that not as a one-way door. So if I'm seeing that something's not working, I will iterate it, but I'll iterate it in a way that isn't sort of. I'm going to still allow myself to return to an earlier version if the earlier version was better. So I think if you see something isn't working, you've got. I saw a really good video about this, which compared it to sort of search space and search algorithms. You've basically got two ways of approaching finding a solution for a particular mechanical problem. One is to just shoot in the dark, and then once you get something that feels like a hit, to do a local search. Or you can say, well, I've got something, let me do an iteration. Let me do an iteration, okay, let's come back, let's do an iteration in that direction. So you've kind of got to combine both of these ideas, where if something in your game stinks and you can't figure it out, you've got to either iterate mindfully with an ability to come back and change your mind, or you just got to just try something completely wildly different. Just go, okay, fine. This thing that I thought was sacrosanct and was the heart of the game design, fuck it, throw it away. Let's do something completely different and see if it breaks. And often it doesn't, and often you find a magical new way through to, because ultimately the mechanics in your game don't matter. It's the feeling, it's the alchemy of your mechanics and your theme and the components in the hearts and minds of your players that matters. And there's a ton of mechanics, and all of them are fine, and it's the alchemy of the mechanics that matters. And so I'm very non-precious about the mechanics because they never matter until they do. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of finding people the types of people you get to play test games, is there mileage in sort of trying to explore like casual gamers, hardcore gamers, people that don't really play games, or is it better to try and stick with a certain type? Because obviously for most of the people here, when we playtest, we're playtesting with other designers as well, so the type of feedback you get tends to be quite specific in that sort of way. But I've playtested in the past with people with graphic designers that don't do any games, and it was a very different playtest sort of result. Yeah,
so I think the answer to that question lies in your understanding of the target player. And I know that's sort of turning it back round, but when you're designing a game, you're not designing it for everyone. You've got a target player in mind, and you're going to make a bunch of decisions throughout your design process based on what that target audience is. And if it is a game that anyone can play, it's like a family game or it's a casual game, you're going to want to find those kinds of players, but also to then mix in with certain kinds of other contrary players to find out whether there's something that really doesn't work for them. So I think the answer to that is really about what your conception as a games designer is of the target audience, and then not to waste your time getting feedback from people who are never going to like your game. The other thing I would say though is there's sort of a different axis of that, which is in tabletop games. I'm not certain how true this is in digital games, but in tabletop games, Magic the Gathering designers about 15 or 20 years ago came out with the idea of the player personas, the Spike, the Timmy, the Vorthes, and so on. And I think that is a very useful way of thinking about your playtesting community, which is, am I accidentally testing with a bunch of people who are sort of sympathetic to mechanics not being brilliant because they're loving the story that your game creates? And have you got a couple of people in your group who are basically just robots and are just there to compute the system and break it and find the loopholes? And those people are also good people. They're just finding a different way of enjoying your game. And I think if you don't have some of each of those in your playtesting group, you're going to end up with a slightly wonky view or a set of wonky feedback about what your game, how successful your game is. Because if you've got commercial aspirations, you are going to have to deal with the reality that there are a spectrum of ways of extracting fun from games, and so being mindful about making sure that people who like games because of the extrinsic motivations of winning or the extrinsic motivations of enjoying their friends' company versus those people who are more intrinsically motivated by the game world or the manipulation of systems and the mastery of those systems. Like all of those parts of the sort of player plot are all valid, and not every game can satisfy all of them, but you definitely don't want to accidentally playtest with only one group of player personas.
I would just add that I do generally right at the end, I have a couple of people that I like to show the game to and say, break this. Show me how you can break it. Because in most of my games, you build things. You build a character, you build an army or whatever. And it's really useful to have those people that love to just find the superpower combo, because that's what they love about games, and that's great. But it's usually really unfun for the other player. So it's good to know that, so I can nerf it or eliminate it before it comes out.
How would you say you scale like the difficulty based on the playtesting?
Well, I suppose almost all of my games have been multiplayer games, so I don't have to tend to deal with that. I do have one game called Perilous Tales, which is a fully solo miniatures game. I don't have a good answer for that, because I think that deserves a better answer that I'm able to give. I think when I'm testing multiplayer games, it's about how the players feel skill gaps are represented by the play experience being very unbalanced or very balanced. And so difficulty in a multiplayer game, I think maybe there's interpretation of like, well, how difficult is this to operate as a system? Is it too complicated? Should I make it simpler? Or is it and one thing that I'm quite passionate about is like, is it too difficult to do things, to move the game forward? A lot of games are excited by stopping you from doing things, preventing you from doing things, giving tools to your opponent to prevent you from doing things, which I happen to hate. I like games where everyone gets to do things, and my response to you doing something is I get to do more, rather than my response to you doing something is to stop you from doing it. Those are just two different meanings of difficulty that I'm bouncing off, which have nothing to do with actual difficulty in like a single player game. Is that an acceptable answer?
Yeah.
Okay, fine, cool.
Do you find it useful to go back and do repeated playtests with players who have in the past given you particularly useful feedback, or is kind of like the drawback of them already having playtested the game before a bit too significant to do so?
That's a good point, actually. That's something I should include in this. So the answer is both. Like, particularly in the blind test playtesting stage, but also quite early on, fresh minds, the first contact with your game, just insanely valuable. Like, you learn things that no one else can tell you. At the same time, someone who is close to you, who understands your vision, who's seen multiple iterations, who's seen what's been tried, who understands the game at a deeper level, is just going to give you feedback that no one else can see. So I have to combine both in the way that I playtest. And finding that core group of people that's going to give you that really detailed feedback is, as Joe pointed out, like, incredibly valuable, but also really difficult to achieve. And then going out and getting new people, like, there's multiple ways of doing that. Like, sort of guerrilla testing is probably the easiest way. Finding ways to spam it out, to early access communities, but crucially finding ways to get that first impact, that first impression. So yeah, both. Did you have a question?
Oh, sorry, I was waiting, just was shooting right past the question.
So kind of similar to that question. If you're like, let's say, how you're saying there's a bunch of different types of playtesting you can do, and it changes throughout the whole process. Yeah. Like if you're let's say you're in the middle of it and you're playtesting, you have the same. Do you switch up the people that you're playtesting with, or a mix of both, or?
I mean, I wish I had the option to switch up the people I'm playtesting with. Like this sort of group of people. Like at my best, I ended up with a local group of 7 or 8 regular playtesters who I could convince to show up on a Tuesday and playtest the game with, and that I've never achieved that again. Like that was the pinnacle. So I think you get what you can get. If I had a magic wand, I would do both, and I would have a rotating door of new people and an absolute core group. That
So it's important to have as much of a balance as both as you can, because they give different sort of.
Yeah, they do give different. I mean, like in this sort of mid-late stage, like you do need those experienced playtesters, because you're not challenging fundamental assumptions about your game as much anymore. Although you should still be open to that. You're optimizing, you're tweaking, you're balancing, you're making sure every option is fun, you're making sure every play mode is fun, and
intuitive.
Yeah, and so those people who know like how much fun you can have in these three scenarios, and they're like, well, hey, Mike, this one's kind of crummy compared to the other one. It's fine, but it doesn't shine like these other ones do. Like, make it better. No, they're the people that are. They're the people who are more useful to you there. And then once you think you have a thing, and you're pretty sure it's absolutely bang on, then these people will tell you whether you've really like misexplained something, or you've got some absence in your design, in your presentation on your design.
I'd add to that. Most people don't want to playtest. Like, they may even say they want to playtest, they don't. They either want to come and play a game, or they're just curious what you've written. So finding people that will actually playtest is beautiful.
Yeah, and so
Hold on
I guess
to people.
like my advice to you guys is like, be good citizens, go find other people's games and playtest them. Partly because there's not enough playtesters in the world, and the answer to these questions is more people like you doing it. But the other thing is that playtesting somebody else's game is just a beautiful insight into what it's going to be like, and learning from other people's mistakes. And it is for me. I find it quite a nourishing and developmental experience. Every time I read someone's rulebook, I learn something that I'm going to avoid doing the next time.
Seeing the bad is often more valuable than seeing the good.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the good, you often don't know why it's good, but the bad, you know, right, I won't do that. Yeah.
What would you say is like? So you were talking about like playtesting with intention. What have you found to be like the most important thing to test?
I suppose the answer to that question depends a little bit on the scope. So if I'm talking about miniatures games, which is the thing that I mostly focus on, the thing that most often goes wrong and takes the most testing is the victory conditions, the like objective of the game, the why are we here? Because I can have an incredibly lovely machine with all kinds of fun levers and dials, and the machine is brilliant to operate. But if the victory conditions aren't right, basically the engine of fun never gets going, or it immediately goes off the track. So how this manifests often is, we'll set up the toy box, and then, one person will spot that the objective is trivial to complete if they do unfun thing X. And so they are incentivized to do unfun thing X, and the game is no longer fun because, standing at the back doing nothing, hiding behind a tree turns out to be the optimum strategy because of the victory conditions. Great, so I need to change the objectives of this game because the objectives are not interestingly generating engagement. So I can playtest the mechanics almost ad infinitum because I love playing with dials and knobs and changing the way that the machine feels. But if I don't get the slightly tedious work of making sure that two combatants are, the objective is both, understandable, but also generating engagement. That's almost always the thing where I start getting the saddest and the work starts. Any other questions? Yes.
Like, playtesting is quite a niche thing in the sense that you have multiple data sets, you have multiple player groups, all this kind of stuff. It's kind of, if you're playtesting with so many groups to the point where you have so much data, is it, like, how hard is it for people to kind of have that kind of clean data?
Yeah, there's no clean data.
Yeah.
That's just
And you're lucky if you have so much data that you're having trouble sifting it.
Yeah.
It's just because for me, this is art, and the art is inspiring in other people a sense that they have agency, and the decisions that they make lead to feelings. And there's just no way of, for me, at the scale that I'm at, there's no way of wrapping that in data. And to a degree, I think, even in big video game companies, they deeply struggle with this idea that they're trying to engender an experience, and there's no way of measuring that. It just lives intangibly in the mind of the player. So it's about watching these external clues and gathering that qualitative data about whether you are observing them, experiencing the things that you were trying to engender them to experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I have tried collecting data in like forms and formats and stuff and getting people to vote on things, but it's not really quantitative data, it's just more qualitative signals, really.
So when you said people, when you play test, are usually nice to you about your game, would you say it'd be useful to just tell them, be as brutal as you possibly can be and tell me all the things that are wrong with this game?
Yes. Yes, that is what I do, but it also doesn't always work. And so this idea of like lying to them and distancing yourself from the product, I think is another useful way of basically making sure they don't.
Why do you say that doesn't always work?
Because people are nice, and you say, tell me everything that you hate about me, and they go, I don't hate you, you're nice. And that's good. It's no good to me. I don't want to know whether you think I'm nice.
You can't also overload the designer, though. It's like, here's the 18 things that are wrong with your game.
Yeah.
I'll tend to go, forget it.
Yeah,
it's too much, I can't.
To build on that question, do you find it better to ask them to be brutal before playing a game or after playing a game? In terms of like, is it going to kind of cloud their playthrough, or will you kind of want that element of clouding so they take note of the bad experiences?
Yeah, I think back to the playtesting with intention. What I will do with playtesters up front is I will set their understanding of what it is I'm looking for from this. So, I will tend less to say, I'm looking for negative feedback, but more like, keep your eyes on these things, or today we're testing this, or like what I really want feedback on is this subsection, or this element of the game, so that they're alive to the right things, and so that I've given them permission to be critical of those things because I'm inviting their collaboration on those areas. And then I will finish the playtesting session by pretty much always saying, cool, so what was the worst thing about that game? What didn't work for you?
So when you play, let's say you play testing the game and it's very initial, like stages of the game, and you find that everything's wrong within the game, you just kind of go back to square one and just kind of restart the whole idea and kind of okay, what will work, what doesn't work, and then kind of restart from scratch.
So I think so I've had that happen multiple times. My game Billion Suns just collapsed about 3 months into the design process. What you need to ask yourself is there a problem with my idea? Is there a problem with the design principles that I have used to express the boundaries of my implementation of that idea? Or is there something wrong with my mechanics? And happily, the mechanics are the cheapest thing to change. And so if the game stinks, then I'll go one step back and go, okay, are my principles right? Am I shooting for the right kind of thing? And that might lead me back to, oh God, this is actually the wrong idea. So with A Billion Suns, just to give you a specific example here. So with A Billion Suns, I played some spaceship miniature games with big capital ships in space. It was a Star Wars Armada game and another one that I can't remember the name of right now. And I didn't like them, and they didn't play the way that I wanted to, and I got inspired to write a spaceship game. And I had this idea for a spaceship game, and then during the initial playtesting, maybe 3 or 5 months in, the game was horrible and I didn't like it. And I came back, and the principles looked sound for the idea that I had, but I went backwards from the principles and went, actually, I'm not excited about this idea. This idea is wrong. The thing that I'm excited about with spaceship games is X, and it was a specific moment in a Star Wars movie where a Carillion cruiser was trying to escape from a planet, and a Star Destroyer turns up and just smashes it to pieces because it's like appeared from hyperspace. I was like, that is something that's never happened in a tabletop miniatures game with spaceships. How do I make that happen? And so I replaced the idea at the heart of it. Everything had to ripple forward from there. Okay, new design principles. None of these systems make sense. Still the same game? I don't know, but like sometimes those 3 things, you don't know where the problem is. You just have to look at them.
There is also a possibility you've got the wrong playtesters. It's not something you've covered, but
that's true.
If you've got people that don't like spaceship games,
Yeah.
It may be that nothing they tell you will be valid.
Yeah, and if you keep getting playtesting feedback that disagrees with your vision, then you might have the wrong. To your point about who am I testing with, you might just have the wrong people. Hey.
Just interested. I know it's kind of hard to do with board games in a sense, but some digital companies kind of like hire cheaters or hackers to like try and break stuff. Have you guys ever done that like with a board game to see if someone would actually like make a fake card and like put it in the game?
No, not that far in terms of like, actual hacking of the game. But like to Joe's point earlier, like there are certain types of people who will look for loopholes and will seek to break your game, and those people are essentially the white hats of your game design process. They're like, I think this is beautiful, everyone else seems to love it, and then someone just comes in and goes, yeah, but if you only take peasants, the whole thing is just garbage and peasants always win. And you're like, oh, for God's sake, right, you better make peasants more expensive or something.
That's why they have to ban most Magic cards. Because people figure out how to make the game unfun by using 4 of them.
Would you say sometimes it's useful to have playtesters that that don't like a same genre of the game just to have a different perspective?
Yes, but you have to be cautious of their feedback.
Yeah.
So if I'm building a Euro board game with Victory Point Salad, and I bring someone who doesn't like those games, and they tell me all the things that's wrong with it, their feedback isn't super relevant. Like, their detailed feedback about what they don't like is them just making excuses for why they hate the thing as a thing. So I would be cautious about that. I think that's why, and it's the same with product design. You've got to pick your audience. You've got to design to your audience because your game isn't going to be for everyone. And don't go testing and getting opinions from people that your game is not for. Should we have one more question and then we should go have lunch?
Why should you work for Amazon?
They're shit. So much for lunch.
Yeah, I did kind of set that one up. Someone asked a question about what it's like working in a company versus working by yourself. The thing that's lovely about a company is having a sense of community and having bright minds who share your values to spark off against, but who sometimes have slightly different values and challenge you on your values and make you a better person. Working at Amazon was like turning up to a house party where you're going to meet your friends, but your friends haven't shown up yet, and no one will talk to you. It was awful.
Yeah, I think that's actually the best answer. Like, why work for a company? The other people in the company. That's really because that's what's going to keep you there, and that's what's going to be enjoyable. And if you like those people, it's probably worth staying for a while. If you don't.
Yeah, and the other thing is that if the company has a purpose, has a thing that they can achieve that you want to be part of achieving, there are things that you can achieve in a company that you can never achieve by yourself, and that can be wonderful if it is a just and noble cause, which can be as simple as providing an incredible piece of entertainment art that brings people together. Cool. All right. Thank you very much for your attention. Wonderful.